Introduction. Foucault notes that Blondel makes a criticism of Freud's psychoanalytic theories. In fact, Freudian analysis itself led to the obsolescence of hysteria. And here in the domain of psychopathology, what we now bring to light is not the agent of the illness, but the meaning. That hysterical oblivion had a content, that pythiatic paralysis was another way of acting, and that suggestibility could be an awakening of eros. In this way, functional disorders such as paralysis, the unconscious, forgetting, these can be linked with psychological events that made them possible. Traumatic events, rejections of the past, negations of reality, desires to flee into madness. Hysteria underlines the distinction between the vital functions and the lived history, which allows us to move beyond the division of the soul and the body into the world of effects, the functional and the historical. Yet time and time again we see the divisions of man rear its ugly head. Through history, the evolution of man is tied to a destiny, splitting us between the modern and the primitive, between the adapted man and the sick man. This anthropology follows us everywhere, in the notions of the child and the primitive regression, in Genet's notion of psychic energy, as if any attempt to unify life goes hand in hand with a division in humanism. And the decisive moment in Freud's work is undoubtedly when he renounces the search for unity in psychology. He abandons the theme of the vital, placing the psychology of Genesis purely in the realm of experience. The structure of meaning is cleaved from evolutionary structures. And in this sense, Freud's return to lived experience is similar to that of Husserl. We must look for the phenomenological essence, not in the real sensation, but in the horizon of the possible. What phenomenological psychology demands is rigorous description, a static analysis and a genetic description, a trace of the thematic evolution of the lived experience. Thus, from the eidetics of lived experience to the genesis of constitutions, a phenomenological description radicalizes the essence of consciousness and reveals it as its constitutive activity. That is, the immediate presence of a world is a self-evidence which is accomplished, which comes to fill the act in which it is realized. Now, for the hysterical, or the pathological experience, the world is no longer presupposed, it is excluded through the body, or the image takes on the appearance of an overpresence that repels the presence of reality and alters its meaning. It is important to note that for the hysterical, this is a negation at work, a crossing out. And as for the contradictions and schizophrenic ambivalence, we see a world enveloped in its ultimate meaning. We must distinguish this negation from the forgetting of positivities as they recede into history. By contrast, negation takes the form of an expression, a no, a not this, a cry of anguish, and a critique. And in this sense, the world becomes a non-world. Not in the sense that it is everything but the real world, but in the sense that it is a negation of the world. And in it, everything appears negated. Life is at the same time death. Being is recognized there as non-being. And far from defining this as a contradiction, as a precise genetic moment, we can describe it as an act, a process of constitution, a pathological genesis that German psychiatrists designate as doomsday madness. And yet this leap could not be said to be derivative of anything. It is a strictly original madness. And these are the descriptions that psychopathologists such as Jaspers attempt to make. But inevitably they run up against enigmatic experiences, impenetrable systems of illusion. The error here, Foucault suggests, is to assume that there is something to be discovered. To treat the expressions of a patient as derivative, as the effect of some underlying disturbance, as if all these symptoms of the patient were indications of an underlying cause that we must return to investigate. The patient is objectified and placed into a natural causality. In other words, they remove the patient's subjectivity. They assume that the patient could not be the cause. Foucault wonders what would it mean if the patient were responsible for their own dispossession of higher faculties. In such a case, it'll be necessary to abandon the descriptivist approach and try instead to describe being in the world. We'll investigate this existential analysis today. We'll see how Daseins analyse eschews dialectics for an ontology, and this in terms of space, time, and the experience of others. Space. So what could the experience of space be, if freed from the requirements of lived experience? Primarily that original, non-derivative space does not offer itself as coherent or complete, nor even as a geometric structure of simultaneity. No, A space of this type is only constituted through a genesis. There is a spatial structuration in a historical profile. But we must not try to return to any origin of any clear initial conditions. We must describe this content as it is. If there is a distinction between the space of the body and the space of the environment, this coherence must be constantly repeated. For example, a space polarized towards a goal. Failures to maintain this repetition were studied by Schilder, Gelb, and Goldstein. They assume an optical component and a motor component, and these may be confused in the mental patient. There may be a dissociation between the distant space and the close space. For example, a patient of Binswanger's who confuses his migraines for pieces of railway track lodging in his head. And this change in the lability or rigidity of relationships are often experienced as magic, as manifestation of a superior power. But it is also an affective space, an emotional space. For example, these dreams of an eagle soaring above a valley, which bring great calm and joy, which Binswanger measures on a scale from victory to tragedy. For example, the case of Ellen West, she has an unreal flight to jubilation and a fall without ever being able to establish a consistent and solid emotional space, a firm ground where continuous progression is assured. So, what are we to make of all these spaces? We must recall that the theme Foucault is developing, across many works, is the silencing of prophecy. This effort to force us to look at the world only through the effects on a stateful substrate that receives impressions, so that the original enunciation is removed, along with any meaning that the act itself may indicate. Or maybe it's more accurate to say that society regulates how these enunciations are heard. Foucault notes that divided spaces are not so uncommon in the sane individual. A society may maintain divided and chimerical spaces, heterotopias. The cohesion of a sacred place may be placed in adjacency to the cohesion of a profane space. Spaces to be favored and protected, spaces which are enveloped more and more. Which is to say that these original expressions can be captured in knowledge, in an anthropology. The Weltanschauung of man. Time. A similar analysis can be made of time. We may note that what is unified in our culture may be disunified in another. For example, if prior to Hegel, history was the work of God, whereas man's experience was one of not being able to break through the screen of everyday time to affect history, phobia illustrates this duality. We see empty spaces which prevent us from reaching the future, or dirty spaces that risk a permanent impurity. The problem is to reach the fundamental point where historicity and temporality meet. But Freud and Minkowski take differing approaches. While Freud sees the destinies of history at work, Minkowski analyzes disruptions of temporality. There's a future without any assurance. The past no longer seems to flow, and the weight of existence seems to accumulate. At this point, Freud seems to have lost his nerve, because for him, temporality and history meet not in the space of reasons, not in the time of history, not in the time of consciousness, but in the physical world, the biological world, the vital sphere with its animal laws of evolution. It is as if he returns to nature, to what already was and we must understand again, rather than a prophecy of the future. What could psychoanalysis be if we acknowledge that man can affect history? It would mean acknowledging that the subject can break through the screen of everyday time. Biographical time and lived time can be spoken about in the same terms, which is the existential schema of tragic expression. That is to say that a biography and a lived experience of illness are not in a relationship of cause and effect. Rather, there is a unity of meaning, not derived from a single source of truth, but each part of the original expression. Or more precisely, they form a single opposition. On one hand, a transitive, solid, and regular time, which opens up to reflection all the possibilities of return. And on the other hand, a time of an intransitive style, of a consciousness that goes beyond itself as a flow. That is, the regular progression of time and the protensions and retentions of a consciousness, an oscillation between objectivity and subjectivity. One of Storch's analyses gives a clear example. A period of illness and crisis, followed by a period where the world is dead and he himself has become a god. It is the child of a fairly disunited household. The patient's existence will therefore be divided between two ways of existing: the godlike knowledge deployed in the transparency of absolute light versus the life in darkness in the abyss. On one hand, perpetual security, on the other, permanent death. Ultimately, all these ways of moving towards the world, of opening oneself up to it, of projecting oneself onto it, and if one's project is contradictory, for example, abandoning oneself to the world, and also taking it back in the form of a subjective totality, an ultimate meaning can be ascribed. For example, certain repetitions would be something like existences that refuse the work of progress. We have something of the accusation against Anaximander, careful protector of being. He must protect, preserve, maintain his expressions and his assimilations. Obviously, an example where the truth of man is supposed to lie within man. Foucault suggests that this is to promote the past to the level of the essence, giving it the destiny of a corpse. But in this way, a task is presented. One must take possession of the past, a paradoxical mastery in which one passes from life to a death in destiny. And here is where the fundamental meaning takes shape. We can characterize all this by saying that it is a project of preserving one's past in flesh and blood, a project of maintaining what was, not at the level of essence, but in the order of continuous and prolonged presence, indefinitely in the quasi-corporeal existence of the ghost. When fantasy and reality mingle, one may act to ensure mastery of this past. The curiosity of psychoanalysis lies in the fact that it attempts to explain these actions not as original enunciations, but as an effect of memory. For Binswanger, time is not the ultimate foundation where the existential and the ontological would meet. The experience of mourning demonstrates that, if time had an ultimate meaning, it would not be the being of human beings, but the existence of other humans. While it may collect the meanings of coexistence, what it indicates is presence or absence. That is, the way the other offers themselves in a perceptual plenitude, or slips away in a wake of absence. Time becomes what is derived from a more fundamental conflict between oneself and the other. When these two freedoms come together, time may either recover itself in love or negate itself in the form of eternity. Foucault notes that the psychiatric tradition, since the 19th century, has given more importance to the perception of others and the modes of interhuman communication. For example, the psychotherapist Pierre Genet, who makes social conduct one of the most fragile achievements in human evolution, the most easily compromised by the fall into psychic tension. Or Bleuler, who described autism as this emotional withdrawal from the world of others. But what is notable in these examples is that the disruption of the relationship with others is the effect of a deeper disorder. It is social only by repercussion. Freud's crucial step was to make the other the protagonist of the drama, experienced not as the effect of the disease, but as an originary aspect of it, both the starting point of a structural development and the origin of meanings. Freed from physiological causation, Freud's analysis lies solely in the domain of meaning. If it is true that previously Freud had been led by the prejudice of naturalism to make libido and instinct biological theories, he showed that as far as human reality is concerned, what we are interested in is the meanings of man. And this is where Binswanger picks up. Yet he criticizes Freud. Why? Well, it has to do with how we analyze this interaction on the stage of meaning with others. For Freud, one interacts with the other as a form of observation, as if facing off against temptation or a terrifying bestiary. Contrast this with Binswanger, who sees the experience of the other as more of a joust. The responses they demand differ greatly. Now, it is helpful to view these in a Husserlian context, where it is said that objects are relatively constituted, deployed, unfolding over time, whereas the person is granted the privilege of immediacy and originality, but also a permanent opacity. Which is to say that there is a distinction drawn between a field of natural determinations and a so-called spiritual reality. It is this spiritual totality that is analyzed, as it appears as the origin of irreducible meanings. For example, the case of Lola Voss, who theorized a conspiracy around her, and she were not the absolute origin of her own meanings. And the experience of space and time themselves also take on meanings. Is space perceived as a void? Is time experienced as an unfolded eternity? For example, the case of Jörg Zund. He lives in a state of continuous alert. The catastrophe could occur at any moment. They live in a different world, and this different world can be described. If the experience of the other is one of flee and fright, we may read this experience as the assertion of one's virility through enthusiasm, or erasing one's singularity through anonymity. Meanings achieved, entered into the context, as assertions and denials, loves and hatreds, so that the existential structure of love is therefore the origin of all meanings and the foundation of all structures. Where Heidegger tries to grasp the being of existence and anguish, Binswanger understands as falling in and out of love. It is also there that he sees the target of therapeutic action, and also a dividing line between the normal and the pathological. Existential anthropology. So Binswanger presents as an orthopedic, refereeing the interactions of the non-normal individual, restoring them to the normality of human love. If Sartre is about restoring people to their presence to make free choices, for Binswanger, it is about rediscovering the unity, guided by the concept of man. A somewhat strange assumption that man is not an ad hoc concept, not coming after the fact. Man is part of the hierarchy. Man is integral to the hierarchy of structures. It is as if there is something theological in these existential analyses. Refusing to be a science of nature, Binswanger's is a science of experience. But what is healing if there is no lesion? If cure simply suggests that the illness was faked? It means that the concrete presence of man fades away in the face of a recourse to the generality of the human being. And illness takes on a negative conception, where doctors must protect us, separating the normal and the pathological. And since there is no materiality of the disease, there is nothing to eliminate. Instead, the task is to return and to reintegrate. And this changes the questioning in the doctor-patient relationship. The material in the patient that is to be analyzed is not found in the history of the patient. And recall, not describing space and time, but only of finding an expression and meaning. Unlike standard psychoanalysis, which gives the present the meaning of the past, existential analysis gives the past the meaning of the present. It is not a question of updating the past to renew old relationships, but of unrealizing the past to create new relationships. For example, the case of Lena as analyzed by Roland Kuhn. If the past invades the living meaning of the present, therapy should consist in giving the past the status of absence, and to make room for an encounter with reality. In and out of love, in and out of absence, the elucidation of the past must have no other meaning than this, and to constitute a new Mitmenschensein. And this the psychotherapist does not from above, from a distance, but they take the real risk in the world of the patient. They abandon indifference and intervene directly in the illness. And there they must face a choice of tools. A Dasein analysis based on love or language and expression. We see Binswanger's choice, speculation on the philosophy of love.